August 17, 1943. Adak Island, territory of Alaska. The Japanese prisoners of war expected death. They found Hollywood. Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a survivor of the suicidal last stand on Attu, stared through the barbed wire of the holding pen, his mind a storm of disbelief. For a year his world had been rock, a screaming wind that never ceased, and a freezing fog that devoured all light and sound. His war was a primeval struggle, scraping lichen from stones for sustenance, counting his last rifle cartridges, watching his comrades freeze to death in their foxholes. This was the Aleutian way, the only way. But now, here on this American fortress island, carved from volcanic rock, a story was circulating. A rumor. A shared madness that felt more dangerous than any truth. It came in fragments, a careless comment from a young Navy guard from Iowa complaining that the film kept tearing. A snatch of orchestral music carried faintly on the wind, the rhythmic flicker of a projector's beam stabbing through the endless gray dusk. They whispered it to each other in the damp barracks, the words a heresy against the warrior code of sacrifice they had lived and died for. They said the Americans had done something impossible, something profane. Amid the endless mud, the Quonset huts, and the miles of steel matting laid over the tundra, the Americans had taken the time and resources to build a movie theater. The Germans at Normandy expected American barbarism. They found American abundance, not just material abundance, an abundance of spirit. For Tanaka and his men, the shock was infinitely greater. They had fought an enemy whose industrial resources seemed magical, a nation that could conjure fleets from its shipyards. They understood that. It was a war of production. But this was not production. This was a cultural statement. The sheer, unmitigated audacity to plant a palace of fantasy on the doorstep of a forgotten war, a place the press dubbed the birthplace of the winds. Nobody could confirm it for certain. But the rumors persisted. Rumors always persisted in the fog. The official histories of the Aleutian Islands campaign, one of World War II's least remembered but most brutal theaters, speak of the monumental effort to dislodge Japanese forces from Attu and Kiska. It was the first occupation of U.S. soil since the War of 1812. The campaign was a logistical nightmare, a battle fought as much against the planet as against a human foe. Planes crashed into mountains they never saw. Patrols vanished into the mists. The Army's own reports called the land a place where hell had frozen over. Yet somewhere deep in the archives, in a file designated Akam Sevsabi Welfare, a different story is told. A single requisition order from September 1942, filed by the Navy's 24th Construction Battalion, requests 200 folding chairs, asbestos sheeting for a projection booth, and 1,000 feet of wiring. The justification line contained a single unbelievable word: cinema. Cinema. To the Japanese soldiers, men drilled for years to endure the unendurable, this was a psychological blow more devastating than any artillery barrage. Their military doctrine was built on Seishin, the primacy of spiritual strength over material wealth. They could withstand hunger, cold, and pain, but how could they fight an enemy who, in the midst of such hardship, not only brought enough guns and food, but also brought Clark Gable? It defied every principle of warfare and honor they had ever known. It was decadent. It was wasteful. It was, they concluded, a sign of a terrifying and unassailable power. This is the story of that movie theater on the edge of the world. It is an investigation into a legend that has become a footnote in a forgotten conflict. Was it a calculated act of psychological warfare? A simple, desperate attempt by homesick American soldiers to preserve their own sanity in an insane environment? Or was it something more? By peeling back 80 years of fog and myth, sifting through declassified records and the accounts of the men who were there, we will uncover the truth behind the structure that left Japanese prisoners of war certain of one shattering thing: they could never win. January 11th, 1952. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. The file was marked for destruction. It had no name, just a number. 72A, nobody was supposed to remember. Nobody was supposed to ask. Because this was the war everyone agreed to forget. It began with the land itself, a place that did not want people. An archipelago of daggers stretching over 1,000 miles from the Alaskan Peninsula toward Russia. A bridge of broken volcanic teeth separating the Bering Sea from the Pacific Ocean. The Aleutian Islands. Even the name sounded like a disease. The men who went there had other names for it. The birthplace of the winds. The chain. The shithole of the universe. It was American soil. An alien, hostile, forgotten piece of America. The weather was a living enemy. It wasn't just cold, it was a vicious, animate cold that hunted you. And the wind. The locals had a name for it. A willy-waw. It wasn't a gale or a storm, it was a sudden, violent explosion of air, a physical blow from an invisible fist. A willy-waw could come from a clear sky, a blast of over 100 miles per hour that could lift a 200-pound man and throw him into the sea. Men learned to walk bent over, clutching their rifles, their faces raw and grimacing against a force that wanted to peel them from the face of the earth. They learned to fear the stillness before the storm, the terrible, silent intake of breath before the world screamed. The strategists saw things differently. They didn't see the mud or the fog. They saw a map. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters saw a path. A northern route to the Americas, a way to cut the supply lines between the United States and the Soviet Union. A way to sow terror. They imagined long-range bombers lifting off from runways carved into the tundra, appearing like ghosts over Seattle, over Portland, over San Francisco. They imagined panic. They imagined a nation looking over its shoulder, afraid of its own shadow. A dagger, a perfectly placed dagger. In Washington, they saw the same map, and they felt the same fear. The fear was a cold sweat on the back of the neck. It was a whisper in the halls of the War Department. What if? What if they could? The West Coast was vulnerable. Defenses were thin. Rumors spread. Maybe it had already happened. Maybe a submarine had surfaced off the coast of Oregon. Maybe spies were already in place. The fear was a poison, a slow, creeping poison. And then it wasn't a fear anymore. It was a fact. June 6th, 1942. While the world's eyes were on Midway, a small Japanese force slipped through the fog. They came ashore on Kiska Island. Not an army, not an armada, just 500 naval infantrymen, moving silently onto the black volcanic sand. They found what they were looking for, a small U.S. Navy weather station manned by 10 men and a dog named Explosion. 10 men watching the sky, charting the wind. They were the only uniformed Americans on an island 3 times the size of Guam. They never saw the ships. The report, buried deep in File 72A, stated the facts coldly. 2 men killed in the brief, one-sided skirmish. The station chief, Petty Officer William C. House, and his assistant, a young aerographer's mate from Wisconsin named John Turner. The first American military personnel killed by a foreign enemy on North American soil since the War of 1812. 8 others were captured. 8 men who simply vanished. Their names were listed. Miller, Snooty, Larson, Chenot, a list of ghosts. Their fate became another Aleutian mystery, another secret swallowed by the fog. Living there was a slow-motion battle for survival, a war fought not with bullets but with every single breath. For 6 months of the year there was no night, only a relentless, gray, 24-hour twilight that frayed the nerves and erased the concept of time. Men forgot what day it was. They forgot what sleep felt like. Then came the other 6 months. 6 months of a sun that barely rose, a world of perpetual dusk and unending darkness, where the wind shrieked like a banshee and temperatures rarely crawled above freezing. It was a war against the very ground beneath their feet. The tundra, a spongy morass they called muskeg, could swallow a man to his knees. It sucked at their boots, froze their feet, and promised diseases with names like trench foot and immersion foot. Supplies were always scarce, always late. Sometimes it was just coffee and spam for weeks, sometimes it was nothing. And into this barren, God-forsaken landscape, the military machine arrived. It was a shocking violation. On islands that had known nothing but volcanoes and sea lions, airstrips suddenly appeared, vast grids of perforated steel matting laid directly onto the fragile tundra. Quonset huts sprouted like metallic mushrooms, their thin walls providing little comfort against the screaming willywaws. Barracks, mess halls, hangars, and anti-aircraft guns scarred the pristine, brutal beauty of the land. A contrast so stark it felt insane. The primeval rock and the sudden, ugly geometry of war. Rusting metal against a backdrop of eternal gray. On the big maps in Washington, they were just pins in a corkboard. Attu, at the very end of the line. Kiska, the nest of the enemy. Adak, the forward base carved from nothing. Names on a chart. Distant, abstract, cold. But for the 20-year-old draftees from Arizona, from Florida, from places with sunshine and solid ground, these were not names, they were sentences. A sentence to a different planet. A place where the compass spun, the fog ate the horizon, and the silence was broken only by the wind or the cry of a strange bird. They were sent to fight a war nobody at home knew existed, on a piece of America nobody knew they owned. They called it the Forgotten Theater. But the islands did not forget. The islands kept score. Every frozen body, every plane lost in the fog, every mind that snapped in the endless gray light. The islands remembered it all. The Japanese were on Kiska, they were on Attu, they were digging in, and America was about to try and dig them out, with ice picks and bayonets. That's when the real killing started. May 11th, 1943. Cold Bay, Alaska Peninsula. The real enemy had no flag. It carried no rifle. It wore no uniform. The strategists in their warm rooms in Washington, D.C. had planned for a fight against the Japanese. They had not planned for a fight against the Aleutians. They had not planned for the Willywaw. The plan for Attu was simple, arrogantly simple. Land two forces. Squeeze the Japanese garrison under Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki. A 3-day operation, the generals promised. 3 days. The men of the 7th Infantry Division believed it. Young men from California and the Midwest, their blood thin, their minds filled with images of tropical islands, not this gray, treeless hell. They looked at the maps, they listened to the briefings. 3 days. The first day, the fog came. It did not roll in, it materialized. A thick, wet, blinding shroud that turned the world into a space of 10 feet. 10 feet of visibility, 10 feet of life. The landing craft missed their beaches. Radio sets crackled with static, then silence. A silence more terrifying than gunfire. The island was a primordial beast swallowing companies whole. Men vanished into the white emptiness. Just gone. The mountains' jagged teeth of black volcanic rock were slick with ice and hidden by the mist. The ground itself was a trap, muskeg, a soggy, endless bog that pulled at boots, swallowed heavy equipment, and broke the ankles of the unwary. The enemy was the cold. The enemy was the wet. The enemy was the island. Frostbite came first, then trenchfoot. The medics saw things they were not trained for. Feet that were black, swollen, dead on living men. Fingers that snapped off like frozen twigs. Gangrene set in, a sweet, sick smell that clung to the aid stations, a perfume of decay. They were fighting two wars, one against the dug-in, fiercely resisting Imperial soldiers on the high ground. Another against their own bodies, which were freezing, rotting, and falling apart. The 3-day operation stretched into a week, then 2. The fighting was brutal, intimate, fought with grenades and bayonets in the fog. Men died yards from each other, never seeing the face of their killer. Yamasaki's men would not surrender. They knew only one way to end it. On May 29th, they charged, A final suicidal bonsai attack that overran field hospitals and command posts before it was finally bloodily stopped. Attu was secured. The cost was staggering. Over 500 American dead from combat, but hundreds more were casualties of the island itself. Lost to frostbite, to exposure, to the cold, to the wet, to the fog. That was the lesson of Attu, a lesson paid for in blood and frozen limbs. So for Kiska, they would not make the same mistake. Kiska was next, the last Japanese stronghold. Rumors said 10,000 elite troops were dug in there. Waiting, Operation Cottage, they called it. There would be no 3-day fantasy this time. This would be overwhelming force. An armada of nearly 100 ships, 34,000 troops, a mix of seasoned Americans and eager Canadians, all haunted by the stories from Attu. They brought heavy coats, waterproof boots, extra rations. They brought everything. Everything but an enemy. August 15th, 1943, Kiska Island. The landing began in the same spectral fog, a blanket of white so absolute it felt solid. The soldiers went ashore, weapons at the ready, hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They moved through the eerie quiet. Step, pause, listen, step. The only sounds were their own breathing, the slosh of their boots in the black sand, the drip of condensation from their helmets. There were no machine gun nests spitting fire, no mortar shells falling from the sky, no shouts of "Banzai" echoing from the mist-shrouded ridges. The silence was wrong. It was a deep, profound, unnatural silence. Then the casualties started. A private from Ohio, 20 years old, tripped a wire near a supply dump. The resulting explosion tore him in half. A booby trap. Later, a nervous Canadian sentry saw a shape moving in the fog. He fired. The shape, an American corporal from Texas, fired back. 2 men lay dead from friendly fire. The fog was the battlefield. The fog was the enemy. Shadows were the enemy. Fear was the enemy. Men died. They died from exhaustion, from accidents, from mines left in the sand, from bullets fired by their own comrades. The medics' reports were a litany of tragic absurdities. Gunshot wound, self-inflicted, fall from cliff, exposure, crushed by vehicle. The phantom battle for Kiska claimed over 300 casualties in the first few days. 300. They pressed inland, cautiously, expecting ambush at every turn. They found empty barracks, cold cooking stoves, neatly swept floors. In one bunker, a phonograph with a record still on the turntable. In another, a chalkboard with a taunting message scrawled in English. They found a single abandoned dog. Nothing else. The Japanese were gone, all of them. Vanished. The report later stated the truth, a truth that was both a relief and a profound humiliation. Under the command of Admiral Masatomi Kimura, the entire Kiska garrison of over 5,000 men had evacuated. On July 29th, 2 full weeks before the invasion, they slipped away on 7 transport ships, shielded by the very same impenetrable fog that the Allies were now fighting. A perfect escape. Silent. Flawless. The entire massive invasion force, the ships, the planes, the 34,000 men, had arrived to conquer a ghost. The war on Kiska should have ended there. A strange, bloodless footnote. It did not. On August 18, 1943, the destroyer USS Abner Red was on routine anti-submarine patrol in the waters just off the island. The invasion was officially over. The men were relaxed. Suddenly, a violent, deafening roar ripped through the evening calm. A massive column of water, smoke, and steel erupted from the ship's stern. The entire back third of the destroyer was simply gone, disintegrated in a flash of orange and black. The ship shuddered, mortally wounded. It was a Japanese mine, a final, posthumous blow from an enemy who was already thousands of miles away. 71 sailors died. They were the final casualties of the battle that never happened. Killed by ghosts. Officially, the Aleutian campaign was a success. The islands were free. But for the men who were there, the ones who survived the cold and the fog and the fear, a question lingered. A question whispered in the barracks on Adak and in the quiet halls of the Pentagon. How could 5,000 soldiers in an entire naval squadron simply disappear without a single intelligence asset noticing? The escape was too perfect, too clean. It defied logic. It defied the laws of war. Some said it was a miracle of naval planning. Others whispered it was a colossal intelligence failure. A very few, believed it was something else entirely. Something had been missed, something fundamental. The strange silence of Kiska was not an ending. It was a beginning. A new file was opened, buried deep within naval intelligence. It wasn't about the battle, it was about the vanishing. The file was given a simple, chilling code name, the Kiska anomaly. And that is when the real investigation began. November 3rd, 1943. Adak Island, territory of Alaska. The Japanese were gone from Attu, gone from Kiska. The fighting, the real fighting, was over. But the war was not. The new enemy had no name. It had no rank. It was the island itself. A slab of volcanic rock and frozen tundra spit out by God into the Bering Sea. They called it the birthplace of the winds, the Williwaw, a wind that could tear a man from his feet, a wind that screamed like a dying animal. It never stopped. Never. Life was a tent, a pyramid tent, stretched taut against the gale. Inside, 4 men, sometimes 6. They slept on canvas cots that sagged in the middle. They breathed air thick with the metallic tang of coal dust. The stoves were pot-belly S521s, glowing red in the perpetual twilight. They were the center of Joggin worlds, little universes of meager warmth. There was no wood, not a single tree on the entire godforsaken island. Only coal, shipped 10,000 miles from a world that had forgotten them. A world of sunshine and trees and solid ground. Private First Class Jimmy O'Malley, 19, from the south side of Chicago, wrote letters. He wrote to his mother, to his girl, to his kid brother. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about the mud that sucked at your boots. He wrote about the eternal gray sky. He did not write about the feeling of being the last man on earth, of being stationed at the end of the world. Around the stove, others played cards, poker, gin, the same worn-out decks, soft and greasy to the touch. They played for cigarettes, for chocolate bars, for the last can of peaches in a sea ration box. They told the same jokes. They sang the same songs. They did anything to keep the silence at bay. The silence that came after the wind died down. The terrible listening silence of the island. And yet, the Americans were building. The Seabees. They were a force of nature unto themselves. They landed with an island and left behind a city. Maybe not a city, something more, a machine. A war machine. Bulldozers, graders, giant shovels clawed at the tundra. They worked under arc lights 24 hours a day. They ignored the wind, the rain, the snow. They moved mountains of earth. They laid down steel matting, section by interlocking section. A runway, a mile long, then 2. They built docks, barracks, hospitals, communication towers. They rose from the mud, from the volcanic rock. It was a miracle of logistics, a testament to a power the Japanese, huddled in Nihovi cold caves on Kiska, could never comprehend. It was not a war of soldiers, it was a war of engineers. The rumor started in October. Whispers in the mess hall, a new Quonset hut, bigger than the others. Nobody knew what for. A new command post, some said. A high-security briefing room, others guessed. Maybe for the cryptographers. The men who listened to the ghost on the radio. The construction was different. They were taking Tommen to time. Insulating the walls, building a proper floor. They ran electrical cables, heavy-duty ones. The kind you use for something that draws a lot of power. Then a crate arrived. A very large crate. It was handled with care. Not like ammunition, not like rations, like it was something precious, something fragile. It was a projector. Two of them. Simplex E7s, straight from a factory in New Jersey. They called it the Attic Ritz, a long, curved Quonset hut, its corrugated steel skin shimmering in the weak Arctic light. It was a palace, a cathedral of tin. Inside there was no red velvet, no gold leaf, just rows of simple wooden benches, hammered together from shipping crates. The screen was a white sheet, a bed sheet stretched tight and pinned to a wooden frame. But to the men of the 11th Air Force, it was more beautiful than Grauman's Chinese theater. It was a portal, a wormhole back to a place called America. The first showing was a Betty Grable movie. They crammed in, shoulder to shoulder, the smell of wet wool and coal smoke, and unwashed men filling the air. The generators hummed, the projector whirred to life. A beam of shaky, dust-filled light cut through the darkness. And then, she was there, Betty Grable, in Technicolor, dancing, singing, smiling, in a world without mud, a world without wind, a world of impossible color and light. For 2 hours, the island disappeared. The war disappeared. There was only the light, the sound, the dream. The men didn't just watch, they absorbed it. They drank it in. It was a transfusion for the soul. And then the main thing started. A work detail of Japanese POWs was marching past. Survivors from Attu. Men who had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, lacking in spirit. They were being led from one barbed wire enclosure to another. Gaunt men in ragged uniforms, their faces masks of grim resignation. They heard the sound first, a strange rhythmic music. Then laughter. Not a single man laughing, a crowd of men. A wave of deep, unrestrained American laughter. The guards let them stop. Let them look. Through the crack in the ill-fitting door, the prisoners saw it. The flickering light. The rows of men. The giant, luminous face of a woman on the wall. They saw soldiers, their enemies, sitting in the dark, roaring with laughter at a moving picture. A picture in a box. In a metal hut. On a barren island at the top of the world. They did not understand the movie. They did not need to. They understood the meaning, the power. The terrifying, casual, inexhaustible power required to build a house of dreams in the middle of a war zone, simply to pass the time. It was not a weapon. It was not a fortress. It was a movie theater. One of the Japanese officers, a sub-lieutenant who had starved and frozen on Kiska for a year, stared at the impossible sight. He saw the benches, the projector, the laughing soldiers. He saw a civilization so powerful it could afford to fight a war and entertain itself at the same time. He turned to the American Guard, a young corporal from Ohio. His face was not angry, not hateful. It was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The sub-lieutenant's lips moved. He whispered something in broken English, a phrase that would later be recorded in a secret intelligence report. How can we fight the radio? December 20th, 1943, Hollywood, California. The story was a lie, and yet it was the truest thing to come out of the war in the North. The most powerful thing. The anecdote about the Japanese prisoners of war captured on the bloody, frozen rock of Attu, standing dumbstruck before an American movie theater. It was perfect. A perfect story. A little too perfect, because it never happened. Not there, not then, not in that way. We searched the archives, the after-action reports from the 7th Infantry Division, the logs of the U.S. Navy, the private diaries of soldiers who survived that hell. Nothing. No mention of a cinema for prisoners on Attu in the summer of 1943. No record of a formal screening held for the handful of broken men pulled from the caves. The story was a ghost, a whisper in the wind, a phantom born of fog and propaganda. But ghosts can be real. They can haunt a generation. This one did. The truth was bigger and messier than a single movie screen. The truth was about logistics, a boring word for an astonishing thing. The Americans brought their country with them, all of it. They didn't just ship men, guns, and bullets. They shipped America itself. The United States military had a weapon the Japanese Imperial Army could never understand, a weapon they could never counter: comfort. The ability to make hell a little more like home. Bulldozers, graders, generators, asphalt rollers, prefabricated Quonset huts. They landed on beaches not just with rifles, but with donut machines, with ice cream makers, with Coca-Cola bottling plants. They built roads on permafrost, airstrips on volcanic ash, and chapels in the tundra. They brought light to the endless Arctic night. Electric light. This was the American miracle. A miracle of mass production. A miracle of ingenuity. Consider the Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions. Their motto was "can do." They were carpenters from Ohio, electricians from Brooklyn, plumbers from Texas. They were middle-aged men who could build a city in a swamp. On Adak, a sprawling base far from the front lines of Atu, they did just that. They built recreation halls. They strung up lights. They had projectors, 16mm Bell and Howell machines, sturdy and reliable. They had film reels flown in from the mainland. James Cagney, Betty Grable, Humphrey Bogart. Hollywood came to the Aleutians. Yes, but it came to the massive, secure rear echelon bases, not to a battlefield still littered with the dead. The Japanese soldier knew only hardship. It was his religion. His honor was forged in deprivation. He lived in a wet hole scraped from the frozen earth, huddled for warmth, gnawing on a ball of cold rice. His world was damp, dark, and filled with the stench of decay. A captured diary from a soldier on Kiska speaks of hunger. It speaks of the cold that seeps into your bones. It speaks of rats. Rats, rats, and more rats. It does not speak of movies. The very concept would have been an alien madness, an insult to the purity of his suffering. So where did the story begin? The perfect, untrue story. Maybe it started with a letter? A 20-year-old private from Des Moines, stationed on Adak, writing home to his girl. He described seeing a movie, the screen flickering against the side of a hut while the wind howled outside. Maybe an intelligence officer debriefing one of the 28 prisoners taken on Atu noted the man's shock at being given a warm meal and a clean blanket. The report stated, "Subject displays profound astonishment at basic amenities." Maybe a journalist hearing these scattered tales stitched them together. The movie on Adak, the prisoner on Atu. He put them in the same place at the same time. He created a scene. Or maybe it was born here, in Hollywood, in a small, smoke-filled office at the Office of War Information. A writer, let's call him Sam Roth, a former screenwriter with a knack for narrative, is given a task. Create stories. Stories that show the difference, the unbridgeable gap between their world and ours. He reads the reports, the letters from lonely GIs, the intelligent summaries about enemy morale. He sees the raw materials, the logistical magic of the Seabees, the Spartan existence of the Japanese, the psychological shock of the captured. He takes a fact here, an emotion there. He needs an image, a single powerful image. A Japanese POW, his uniform in tatters, stands in the falling snow. His face is a mask of disbelief. Before him, a Quonset hut glows with impossible light. From inside comes the sound of an orchestra. On a makeshift screen, a beautiful woman is laughing. That was the picture. That was the legend. It wasn't a lie, it was a collage. A mosaic of 1,000 smaller truths, assembled into one shattering symbol. It symbolized the entire American war effort. Overwhelming, almost decadent, and utterly unstoppable. The story spread, from soldier to soldier, from newspaper to radio broadcast. Hollywood comes to the Aleutians. A propaganda poster that was never printed but existed in everyone's mind. On one side, a dark, cramped Japanese dugout. On the other, a bright, warm American rec hall filled with men laughing, drinking coffee, watching a film. The contrast was the weapon. The specific event was a fiction, but the astonishment was real. The cultural collision was real. It happened every time a prisoner was given a chocolate bar. It happened every time a downed pilot was treated in a clean, well-lit sickbay. The story of the movie theater was not the report of a single event. It was a parable. A parable about a nation that could project not just its power, but its very way of life to the ends of the earth. The file marked 72A. It wasn't to hide a secret movie night. It was to bury the recipe, the formula for the perfect myth, the kind of myth that wins a war before the last shot is ever fired. What truly defines victory in a war? Is it the flag raised over a desolate battlefield, or the flicker of a projector beam in the heart of that same desolation? The questions hang in the Aleutian fog, as cold and persistent as the Willowa itself. They echo in the unwritten history of men like Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a survivor sworn to die for his emperor who instead found himself staring through barbed wire at the impossible. A movie theater. A palace of light and shadows erected on a godforsaken slab of frozen volcanic rock, while the echoes of battle still clung to the air. The official records speak of battles won, of casualties counted, of territory gained. They do not speak of the profound cultural vertigo that seized the prisoners. A shock far deeper than capture. They were men from a land of elegant scarcity, of sublime duty, who had sacrificed everything for a spiritual ideal. And they were now the captives of an enemy who, in the very midst of war, demanded movies. This was never just a battle for an island. It was a collision of worlds, a collision of philosophies. One world believed in the glory of the final, perfect sacrifice. The other believed in the inalienable right to a double feature on a Saturday night. Even in hell, especially in hell, the truth was not written in the communiques. It was hidden in the space between what a man was taught to believe and what he saw with his own disbelieving eyes. It was not the simple abundance of machines that Tanaka and his comrades witnessed. They had already learned that bitter lesson from American firepower. No, this was something else entirely. This was an abundance of casual, defiant humanity. An abundance not of bullets, but of belief. The belief that life with all its trivial comforts must stubbornly go on. The belief that a man still deserved a story, a laugh, an escape, even with death scratching at the canvas walls of his tent. It was the abundance of the mundane made magnificent. The audacity to build a cinema before the war was even one. They came as instruments of the emperor's will, honed into blades of flesh and spirit. They expected to meet their counterparts, grim, fatalistic warriors locked in a ritual dance of death. Instead, they found young men from California and the Midwest who complained about the cold, wrote letters home about pretty girls, and then hammered together a cinema from scrap lumber and sheer will. They came as paragons of Bushido, prepared to die. They were utterly unprepared for how the enemy chose to live. History records the Battle of Attu as an American military victory, but perhaps the real victory was quieter and infinitely more confusing. It wasn't signed in a treaty. It was projected at 24 frames per second onto a trembling screen. Some secrets are buried forever under the island's ice. Others flicker in the dark, just out of reach, in the silence of men who saw their entire worldview undone not by a weapon, but by a spectacle. We can dissect the strategies and read the casualty lists, but we will never truly know what shattered inside those prisoners' minds. Was it their faith? Their resolve? Or was it the simple, devastating realization that they were not just fighting soldiers? They were fighting an idea. And perhaps the most unconquerable idea of all is the right to be entertained.